In recent videos, specifically 8.1 and 15.0, I've alluded to my spotty history with Nintendo and how the Nintendo 64 really soured what had been a pretty solid relationship with their hardware and software up to that point. The N64 launch fell pretty flat with me. Super Mario 64 was technically impressive at the time, but it felt far less like a Mario game to me than a generic 3D platformer, at least as generic as a 3D platformer could be in 1996. It just happened to have Mario in it. I had a copy, as you just found yourself with one eventually if you owned an N64 early in its run, but it just didn't resonate with me. Super Mario 64 was the beginning of me becoming the "they changed it, now it sucks" guy, which would be a recurring theme for my N64 experience. Pilot Wings 64 is definitely my favorite of the two launch games, and would in fact grow on me over the years, since chill gaming will almost inevitably wear me down until it's won me over entirely, and my mom's instant enthusiasm for it was at least a little bit infectious. She's actually the one who purchased that game. Still, the early running was rough, and I didn't spend very much time with it at first. To this day, I don't think I've golded every event, so that might have to be something I go back to with the Switch Online expansion pack. If I were to renew my investment in retro gaming rather than trying to sell off, Pilot Wings 64 would certainly have a place in my N64 selection, which, as you'll see in the rest of this video, would be very limited. As I've mentioned before, Wave Race 64 is the game that finally brought me around on the N64 as a whole, at least for a while. Not only is it the game that eventually convinced me of the value of analog sticks, I absolutely loved it for its handling, its water physics, its atmosphere, its soundtrack, its course design, its all-around execution. It's one of those rare perfect games that only come along a few times in your life, and even despite picking my copy up at the premium of $87.99, I have absolutely no regrets, and if I had to do it all over again, I would with no hesitation whatsoever. It's not just my favorite game on the N64, it's one of my favorite games of all time. Mario Kart 64 was the big release that started selling extra controllers, and it would set my views of the series honestly up until this last Mario Kart 8 Deluxe patch. I thought the driving itself felt outstanding, but I also never wrapped my head around why I would want to put a lot of time into a game that literally and directly punished me for doing well. Ridge Racer Revolution was out on the PlayStation right around then, and I felt it gave me a better return on the time I put into it, so I made no such investment in Mario Kart. Instead, my first big multiplayer obsession on the N64 would be Star Fox 64 with some of the people at my local comic shop, but even that paled in comparison to how deeply I got into the single player. I had an excess of free time shortly after its release, and it was the first game I really had a laser focus on mastering. I became downright scholarly when it came to Star Fox 64, grinding out several runs a day, and even studying the player's guide for any strategies or secrets I might have been missing. Now that was a long time ago, and today I can't even form a weak imitation of my level of play back then, as you'll see in the stock footage here. But it was a great time, getting better and better at each level and racking up the results to show for it. Maybe one day I will go back and see if I can reclaim a little of that past glory. Now, GoldenEye 007 wasn't even one of my planned purchases. The store didn't have Final Fantasy VII on launch day, so I called an audible and picked up my intended game later. It just didn't click with me. I had a PC at that point and had been playing games like Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, and Rise of the Triad to satisfy my first-person shooter fix, and compared to those, GoldenEye's relatively plodding pace just didn't do it for me. There were still some good times with it, playing with my friends, and strangely enough my grandmother, who happened to end up being the real GoldenEye fan in the house. I just never understood the appeal when there were other first-person shooters on the system already, like Hexen, that I just felt did the split-screen deathmatch a lot better. Speaking of first-person shooters, Doom 64 was fun for a while, but the lack of any multiplayer felt like the missed opportunity of all missed opportunities, and I didn't even get a full playthrough out of it before I had traded it in. 4-player multi was always the big selling point of the N64, and to have the centerpiece franchise of the entire genre not show up for it is baffling to this day. Already a huge fan of Wipeout XL, see the 10.0 video for a lot more on that. Of course I had to have Wipeout 64. The 4-player split-screen racing was a huge step up from the link cable battles the PlayStation put you through, and although the soundtrack was undoubtedly compromised by the limited technology of game cartridges of that era, the overall vibe of the series was fully intact, and my copy saw a good deal of playtime as a result. I already talked on this channel about the local collection of Kyrex pilots of which I was a part, and it was still there when Wipeout 64 dropped. Those extra controllers saw a lot of use for this one. The first of two games that ended my relationship with the N64 for the remainder of its lifespan was F-Zero X. It wasn't an objectively terrible game, it just didn't mesh with what I had expected a 3D F-Zero game to look, feel, and sound like. The introduction of loop-the-loops, corkscrews, cylinders, and other such elements changed F-Zero from a hovercraft racing concept to entirely gravity-defying. It did contain a couple of tracks that actually did fit my vision of a 3D F-Zero. Mute City 2 immediately comes to mind. But that was next to nothing compared to the over-the-top designs that populated most of the track selection. The overly slippery feel of the game compared to the Super NES original was also off-putting, and the 64DD never made it stateside, so I was never able to put the track editor to use to craft an F-Zero X that more closely fit my tastes. Finally, as much as I'm into hard rock and heavy metal, the approach to the game's soundtrack was kind of jarring coming off of the first game. I was really hoping for something much more in that vein. And then, of course, there's The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Now, admittedly, the things that put me off about this game were amplified by the fact that it felt everyone around me couldn't shut up about how great they thought it all was. If I could have tuned that all out, I probably would have regarded it as a 7 or 7.5 rather than the 6 I generally treated it as back then. Despite the concept being Zelda to the core, the look and feel were far too close to Super Mario 64 for my liking, and the big, empty overworld was horrifically depressing when considering what we got to explore with the original, with A Link to the Past, with Link's Awakening. Add to that a prologue leading up to the first dungeon that overstays its welcome the first time you play through it, and unbearable hand-holding from perhaps the most annoying sidekick of all time, and the well had been thoroughly poisoned by the time you could even say the game really began. I was so done I couldn't stand it. Now, I never did sell off my N64, but from that point on, it would generally be a decoration on my gaming rig until I finally retired it with the release of the GameCube. But thanks to the Virtual Console and the Switch Online expansion pack, the story would not end there. In fact, I was purchasing every game on the Wii Virtual Console week in and week out for the majority of its run, which meant I was buying back into the N64, exposing me to more games. cruis'n USA was entertaining, if not in line with the types of arcade racers I tend to gravitate toward. This was one of the games, along with the Rush series, that made me abundantly aware of the almost RPG-like Japanese-Western split with arcade racers, as there are blatant differences in terms of design philosophy and concept. While Japanese arcade racers are very streamlined, very mechanical, basically glorified circuit racing with a lot of the technicality stripped out in place of game-defining systems, Western arcade racers are more bombastic, full of visual spectacle, shortcuts, ambient traffic, wildly disparate vehicle types, and all manner of other elements that run counter to the heavily standardized Japanese format. If you've been on my channel for a while, you know which side of the fence I come down on, but I still found plenty to enjoy in this one. If Midway had cared more about lateral visibility than lateral movement, some of those turns, even early on, are pretty brutal, I think it would have been a legend. I actually encountered Ridge Racer 64 in 2004 under the name Ridge Racer DS, completely unaware that it was a port of Nintendo's initial cover, if you will, of the Ridge Racer series. It wasn't a great game, and honestly I felt that Asphalt Urban GT blew it away on the DS launch, and that was before I knew of its pedigree. Once I found out that it was developed by the usually stellar Nintendo Software Technologies, who would go on to make Wave Race Blue Storm a year later, I was shocked that such a strong racing studio made such a mediocre take on a legendary arcade racing franchise. It wouldn't be a hard fix, just smooth out the steering and introduce a collision mechanic that doesn't treat all contact as front to back. You'd be left with a pretty solid imitation of a classic. Needless to say, this one didn't improve my view of the N64's library. If you go back to what I said about Pilot Wings 64, everything I said about chill gaming applies just as much to Mario Golf. I was a real latecomer to this series, only getting in with the 3DS installment, but the Switch Online expansion pack brought me back to the N64 title. As little as I care about golf in real life, golf video games have always appealed to me, going all the way back to the original PGA Tour Golf in 4th Gen, up through stuff like the Tiger Woods era and Hot Shots, and even Link's 2004 over on the Xbox. I don't know if the N64 Mario Golf would have the same appeal to me without online play, but I can sit down and unwind with that game for hours. Definitely something that would have been a regular part of my rotation had I found my way to it back in the day. Sin and Punishment is a rail shooter by Treasure, and that's really all the identifying information you need about it. This game was a legend back in the day, in no small part because of its absence, and once it finally made the move stateside thanks to the Wii Virtual Console, it became clear just how wrong we had been done by Nintendo for denying us this game in the N64 years. The control scheme is as awkward as it looks, having you move with the D-pad and control the reticle with either the analog stick or the C buttons, but once you got it down, this game is as addictive as anything else to come from this legendary studio. And all in all, despite its respectable commercial showing, I still consider the N64 to be Nintendo's lowest point overall. The Wii U was by far Nintendo's worst commercial performer, for sure, but the Wii U was undermined by a name that didn't make it abundantly clear to the public that wasn't paying close enough attention to know that the Wii had given way to a new platform. The content itself was just fine, and most of it has proven as such after being given new life on the Switch. At the same time, I'm fully aware that I don't have a complete perspective of the N64 without having put much time at all into the post-1998 releases, so I'm always open to recommendations, especially when it comes to racing games, since I'm of the understanding that the N64 went kind of crazy on those late in its lifespan, and my two favorite games on the platform already are racing games. Maybe after I've had the chance to play more games that hit the N64 after Nintendo lost me with it, I'll be back with another video updating my view of the system's library as a whole. Now, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps the channel. Until next time, I'm Patrick Mifflin, sounding off.